She ain't for auction." The words cut through the morning air, like a blade through canvas, as Jake Whitmore stepped forward, his spurs grinding against the wooden platform. The scent of pine tar and unwashed bodies pressed thick around Millbrook's town square, where a crowd had gathered beneath the territorial courthouse's weathered flagpole. Dust swirled between their boots as murmurs died to silence. The girl stood motionless on the auction block, a coarse burlap sack pulled over her head, her small hands bound with hemp rope. The auctioneer's gavel gleamed in his raised fist, ready to fall on what he'd called settlement of debts against the Morrison homestead. Jake's jaw tightened as he recognized the stance, shoulders squared despite terror, the way she held herself even with her face hidden. "Now hold on there, Whitmore." Sheriff Caleb Barnes stepped between Jake and the platform, his badge catching sunlight like a warning. "This here's legal proceeding under territorial statute. Girl's father owed $300 to Mr. Henley's bank before he took sick and died. Law says his property settles the debt." Jake's hand drifted toward his Colt, then stopped. Around the square, faces watched, some sympathetic, others hungry for spectacle. The smell of fresh bread from Mrs. Patterson's bakery mixed with the metallic tang of fear sweat. A child somewhere cried for water. "Property?" Jake's voice carried the rough edge of a man who'd spent 15 years breaking horses and mending fences. "That's Emma Morrison, 16 years old. I knew her father. Dead man's debts don't die with him." Augustus Henley emerged from the crowd, his black coat immaculate despite the dust. Gold watch chain glinted across his vest as he pulled a leather folder from his coat. "I hold the mortgage papers, signed and witnessed. Everything Thomas Morrison owned, land, livestock, and ward. Transfers to settle accounts." The banker's fingers were soft as a snake's belly, Jake noticed. Never held a rope or swung an axe. The kind who got rich while other men broke their backs. Emma's shoulders trembled beneath the sack, and Jake felt something cold settle in his chest. "Let me see those papers." Henley's smile was thin as winter's soup. "I'm sure a common ranch hand can read figures well enough. $300 plus interest, accumulated over 18 months while Morrison struggled with consumption and crop failure." Jake took the documents, his calloused thumb tracing the ink. Something felt wrong. The writing too precise, the paper too clean for 18 months of handling. But before he could study closer, the auctioneer banged his gavel against the podium. "Opening bid, $50. Wait." Jake stepped forward again, and this time Sheriff Barnes laid a hand on his gun belt. The crowd pressed closer, sensing violence brewing like a summer storm. "Emma, you hear me?" A slight nod from beneath the sack. "Your pa ever mention borrowing from Henley's bank?" The girl's voice came muffled but clear. "No, sir. Papa always said he'd rather starve than owe money to town folk. Said a man's word and his land were all he had worth keeping." Henley's face darkened. "The debt stands recorded in the county ledger. Sheriff Barnes witnessed the filing myself." $50, called a voice from the crowd. Jake turned to see a thick-set man with tobacco stains on his vest, saddlemaker named Dutch, known for working his apprentices near to death. $75. Another bid, from a rancher Jake didn't recognize. The auctioneer raised his gavel again. "Do I hear?" $100. The voice belonged to Marcus Reed, owner of the Broken Wheel Saloon. His smile showed gold teeth, and his eyes held the flat calculation of a man who'd bought and sold more than whiskey. "And I'll take delivery today." Jake's stomach turned. Reed's girls rarely lasted 6 months before disappearing downriver or turning up in unmarked graves outside town. The crowd murmured approval. Reed's money was good, and his business kept certain appetites satisfied without troubling decent folks' daughters. Sold. The gavel began its descent. Jake's knife cleared its sheath in a blur of steel. The blade sliced through the rope, holding the burlap sack, and Emma Morrison's face emerged, pale, frightened, but alive with desperate hope. Her dark hair fell in tangles around her shoulders as Jake stepped between her and the crowd. She ain't for auction. Reed's hand moved toward his pistol, but Jake's Colt was already drawn. The metallic click of the hammer being pulled back echoed across sudden silence. Sheriff Barnes took a step backward, his own weapon half cleared, uncertain. "Now you've done it," Henley hissed, interfering with lawful seizure of property. "Sheriff Barnes, arrest this man." But Jake was studying the mortgage papers again, holding them up to catch the morning sun. "These documents are forgeries," he said, loud enough for the whole square to hear. "Look at the ink." Emma moved closer, her breath shaky but her voice steady. "Papa taught me to read contracts when I turned 15. Said I'd need to know such things." She pointed at the signature line. "That's not his writing. Papa always made his T with a little flourish, like a bird's wing, and he never signed anything without dating it in his own hand." A new voice cut through the tension. "She's right." The crowd parted as Dr. Matthews approached, his medical bag in one hand and a leather portfolio in the other. He'd delivered half the children in Millbrook and buried their grandparents. His word carried weight that no amount of money could buy. "I treated Thomas Morrison through his final illness," the doctor continued. "He asked me to witness his will 3 days before he died." Matthews opened his portfolio and withdrew a folded paper. "Everything goes to his daughter Emma, free and clear. No debts mentioned. And I have his signature on my payment receipts, the real signature." Sheriff Barnes took the will with hands that shook slightly. After a moment, he looked up at Henley. "Doc's right. These mortgage papers don't match. The ink's different too, fresher than 18 months would allow." Henley's face had gone white beneath his carefully trimmed beard. There must be some mistake. My clerk handles the paperwork." "Your clerk's been dead 2 months," Dr. Matthews said quietly. "Consumption, same as Thomas Morrison. I signed the death certificate myself." The auctioneer set down his gavel and backed away from the platform. Dutch melted into the crowd, along with most of the bidders. Only Marcus Reed remained, his hand still hovering near his gun. "This ain't over," Reed growled. "Girls still needs protecting in this town. A lot of men might take it upon themselves to collect what they think they're owed." Jake holstered his Colt but kept his stance ready. "Emma's under my protection now. Anyone wants to test that arrangement can find me at the Double R Ranch." "Since when do you make such decisions, Whitmore?" Sheriff Barnes asked, but his tone had shifted. The badge might be on his chest, but he'd grown up in Millbrook. He knew the difference between law and justice. Emma stepped forward, her chin raised despite the terror still lurking in her eyes. "I choose Mr. Whitmore as my guardian, Sheriff Barnes. Territorial law says I'm old enough to make such decisions, especially with my father's will naming him as alternate trustee." Dr. Matthews nodded. "Thomas Morrison mentioned Jake specifically. Said he was the only man in town who'd never tried to cheat him on cattle deals or take advantage of his illness." The sheriff looked at the will again, then at the forged mortgage papers, then at Augustus Henley's sweating face. "Mr. Henley, I'm placing you under arrest for fraud and attempted kidnapping. You have the right to—" "Wait." Henley's voice cracked. "This is all a misunderstanding. Perhaps we can reach some accommodation." "The only accommodation," Jake said, "is you explaining where Thomas Morrison's actual mortgage money went. Because if he didn't owe you $300, then someone's been stealing from your own bank." A murmur ran through the crowd. Several business owners who banked with Henley began muttering among themselves. Trust, once broken in a frontier town, died harder than a man with 6 bullets in his chest. Sheriff Barnes snapped iron shackles around Henley's wrists. "Circuit judge arrives next week. You can explain everything to him." He turned to Jake and Emma. "Miss Morrison, you'll need to file proper guardianship papers." "Already done," Dr. Matthews said, producing another document. "Thomas asked me to prepare the paperwork before he died. Jake just needs to sign it." As the crowd began to disperse, Marcus Reed lingered near the saloon's entrance. His eyes tracked Emma with the patience of a vulture, and Jake knew this victory was only temporary. Men like Reed didn't give up easily, and a 16-year-old girl with property would always be a target. "We need to get you somewhere safe," Jake murmured to Emma as they walked away from the courthouse. "Reed's got friends who won't care about guardianship papers." "I know." Emma's voice was steady now, though her hands still trembled. "Papa told me about men like him. Said the world had wolves in sheep's clothing, but also sheep in wolves' clothing. Said I'd need to learn the difference." They reached Jake's horse, a sturdy bay gelding named Thunder. As Jake helped Emma up behind the saddle, she spoke again. "Why did you help me? You could have let them sell me and avoided all this trouble." Jake considered the question as he swung up into the saddle. The honest answer was complicated. Memories of his own sister, sold into marriage at 15 to settle family debts back in Missouri. The way Emma held herself reminded him of Sarah's quiet dignity, even in the face of desperation. "Your father was a good man," Jake said finally. "Good men deserve better than having their children auctioned like cattle." They rode out of Millbrook as the sun climbed higher, leaving dust and whispers in their wake. Behind them, Augustus Henley sat in a jail cell, his banking empire beginning to crumble as word spread of his fraudulent practices. Sheriff Barnes had already telegraphed the territorial capital about irregularities in land transactions dating back several years. But Marcus Reed remained free, and Jake knew the saloon owner wouldn't forget Emma Morrison's face or the property she'd inherited. The Double R Ranch was defensible, with good sight lines and honest men who'd stand by their foreman, but it wasn't a fortress. Sooner or later, Reed would make his move. The first attack came 3 days later, just after sunrise. Jake was checking the fence line near Morrison Creek when he heard Thunder whinny in alarm. 6 riders approached from the east, their faces covered with bandanas. Reed wasn't among them, but Jake recognized Dutch the saddle maker and 2 of Reed's regular customers from the saloon. "Morning, Whitmore," Dutch called out, his voice muffled by cloth. "We're here for the girl. Hand her over peaceful-like and nobody gets hurt." Jake's rifle was still in its saddle scabbard, but his Colt sat ready on his hip. 6 against 1. Poor odds. But not impossible if he chose his ground carefully. "Emma's under legal guardianship. You boys are trespassing." "Legal don't mean much out here," one of the masked riders said. "Girl's got property worth more than she knows. Reed figures he can manage it better." "Reed figures wrong." The first shot came from behind a boulder near the creek. Emma Morrison rose from cover with Thomas Morrison's old buffalo rifle, the .50 caliber weapon nearly as tall as she was. Her shot took the leftmost rider clean off his horse. "Papa taught me to shoot," she called to Jake, already reloading. "Said a Morrison never backs down from a fight." The remaining 5 riders scattered, seeking cover among the cottonwoods. Jake used their confusion to reach his rifle, then began picking targets with methodical precision. 2 more men fell before the others decided discretion was the better part of valor and rode hard for town. Dutch wasn't among the survivors. That evening, Sheriff Barnes arrived at the Double R with a warrant. Not for Jake or Emma, but for Marcus Reed. The territorial judge had arrived early and taken a dim view of attempted kidnapping. Reed was arrested while trying to flee town with 2 saddlebags full of gold coins, proceeds from girls who'd been sold to buyers downriver. "He'll hang," Barnes told Jake as they watched the sun set over the ranch. Judge found evidence of at least 4 murders, maybe more. And Augustus Henley's been singing like a church choir about land fraud schemes going back 5 years. Emma sat on the porch steps, cleaning her father's rifle with the careful attention Thomas Morrison had taught her. "What happens to all the property that was stolen?" "Returns to rightful owners, where possible," the sheriff replied. "And what can't be returned goes into a territorial fund for orphans and widows. You'll be administrator, Miss Morrison. Judge says you've got the legal right and the practical experience." Jake felt something ease in his chest. Emma would be safe now, with legal authority backing her decisions and community respect replacing fear. She'd proven herself capable of fighting for what mattered, just as her father had raised her to do. But as the weeks passed, Jake realized the girl, no, the young woman he'd saved from auction had also saved something in him. The hollow ache that had lived in his chest since Sarah's death began to fill with something warmer than grief. Not romance, not yet, but the possibility of family chosen rather than born. Emma seemed to sense the change too. She began teaching him to read better, using her father's collection of law books and territorial regulations. In return, he showed her the finer points of ranch management, cattle breeding, and the 100 small skills that kept a frontier operation profitable. One evening, as autumn painted the cottonwoods gold and red, Emma found Jake mending harness on the porch. She settled beside him with her own needlework, and they worked in comfortable silence as crickets began their nightly chorus. "Jake?" Her voice was soft, uncertain. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if you hadn't stopped that auction?" He considered the question, his hands never pausing in their work. "Sometimes. But thinking about what might have been is like trying to rope the wind. All we have is what is." "And what is?" Jake looked up at her face, seeing not the frightened girl from the auction block, but a young woman who'd found her strength in crisis and held on to it afterward. "What is you're safe, and you're home, and you've got family that won't let anyone hurt you again." Emma smiled, and in that smile Jake saw the echo of Thomas Morrison's quiet dignity, mixed with something entirely her own. "Family," she repeated, as if testing the word's weight. "I like the sound of that." They worked until full darkness fell, their needles and tools guided by lamplight and the kind of trust that couldn't be bought or sold. In the distance, a coyote called across the prairie, but its voice held no menace. Just the wild song of a land where good people could still carve out lives worth living. The next morning brought word that the territorial capital had officially disbanded Henley's bank and redistributed its assets to defrauded settlers. Emma Morrison's name appeared on the territorial registry as administrator of recovered properties, making her one of the youngest legal authorities in frontier history. But Jake's proudest moment came when Emma handed him a small leather folder. Inside, written in her careful script, was a deed transferring half of the Morrison homestead to Jake Whitmore in recognition of services rendered to the family. "Partners?" she asked, extending her hand. "Partners," Jake agreed, and their handshake felt like the beginning of something larger than either of them had imagined. Years later, when Emma Whitmore, she took Jake's name when they married on her 18th birthday, told the story to their own children, she would always emphasize the moment when Jake stepped forward on that auction platform. Not because he was the strongest or the fastest, but because he was there when it mattered most. The old courthouse in Millbrook still bore scars from the day Augustus Henley's banking empire collapsed. But the town had grown stronger in its aftermath. A new school had been built with recovered fraud money, and Emma served on its board of directors. The Double R Ranch prospered under joint management, becoming a model for how frontier partnerships could work when built on trust rather than exploitation. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the work was done and the children were asleep, Jake would find Emma reading on the porch, and he would remember a scared girl with a sack over her head who had grown into a woman capable of changing a whole community's future. Don't forget to subscribe and consider giving a like to help us keep bringing you more stories like these. Your support means everything to us.